moment of closure for many children after a day filled with activity and adventure. But for a boy named James, bedtime was a terrifying ordeal. Though years have passed, James, now an adult, recalls those nights with a chill that still runs down his spine. James was 8 years old when his parents decided it was time for him to have his own room. Until then, he had shared a cozy space with his older brother Henry, who was 5 years his senior. But Henry, naturally, wanted his privacy, so James was moved into a smaller, narrower room at the back of the house. The space was modest, just large enough for a bed and a couple of drawers, with a single window that overlooked the family garden. Even during the day, light seemed reluctant to enter. James was given their old bunk bed, something that sparked a mix of excitement and apprehension. The top bunk felt like an adventure waiting to happen, but being alone for the first time unnerved him. Little did he know those feelings were only the beginning. On that first night, James lay awake, surrounded by his toys scattered on the carpet below. Yet his eyes kept drifting to the bottom bunk, a shadowy void that seemed to demand his attention. But it was empty, neatly made with dark blue sheets and plain white pillows. The faint murmur of his parents' TV in the living room reassured him, and eventually, sleep took him. James awoke to a sound. It was subtle at first, the rustling of sheets below him. Confused and half asleep, he wondered if it was his imagination or maybe the family cat sneaking into his room. But the door was closed tight, as it had been when he went to bed. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. The sheets in the lower bunk seemed alive, twisting and turning as though someone or something was wrestling with them. A wave of fear washed over James as he froze in place. The rustling stopped for a moment, only to be replaced by violent thrashing. The bottom bunk shook as if a restless sleeper was trapped there, tossing and turning in frustration. James, paralyzed with terror, finally let out a cry for his mother. He could hear movement in the house, a glimmer of hope. But before his parents reached the room, the entire bunk bed began to shake violently. The metal frame scraped against the wall as the unseen force below seemed to grow angrier. James gripped his blanket tightly, too afraid to climb down, fearing that whatever lay below would reach out and drag him into the darkness. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the door burst open, and light flooded the room. His mother rushed in to find James trembling on the top bunk. The bottom bunk, however, lay eerily still, the sheets neatly in place, as if no disturbance had ever occurred. James's mother rushed to his side, her comforting presence driving away his fear. Yet, even in her embrace, James couldn't bring himself to explain what had terrified him so deeply. A strange, irrational belief gripped him, that if he dared to speak of the thing in the bottom bunk, it would somehow return, angrier than before. Whether it was true or not, he didn't want to take the chance. That night, his mother stayed in the bottom bunk until morning, her calm breathing eventually lulling him back to an uneasy sleep. But even as his eyes closed, the rustling of sheets would occasionally pull him from slumber, like a whispering reminder that something was there. The next morning, James avoided his room entirely, retreating to the safety of the backyard. He played with his friends in the long, sloping garden, where they climbed trees and wove grand adventures among the overgrown bushes. But no matter how much fun he had, his gaze would occasionally drift to the small, ordinary window of his room. It seemed to stare back at him, a cold, silent reminder that the room was waiting, that it was waiting. That night, James didn't protest when his parents sent him to bed. He climbed into the top bunk with a heavy heart, dreading the darkness that would soon surround him. He didn't dare tell anyone about the terror that awaited him, fearing it might somehow make things worse. But as he lay there, the room's atmosphere shifted, thicker, colder, as though the air itself had turned against him. Then it began. A soft rustling of sheets below. James's heartbeat quickened as he froze in place, the dreadful familiarity of the sound washing over him. Then the rustling stopped. For a moment, there was silence, but it was replaced by something far worse, a slow, rasping breath. It was uneven, almost wheezing, as if something inhuman was struggling to draw air. James's imagination conjured a horrifying image, a figure lying there, its chest heaving with each grotesque gasp. The breathing grew louder, and James prayed that it would leave. But it didn't. Instead, the thing below moved. This time, the movement wasn't wild or animalistic. It was deliberate, purposeful. Whatever was in the bottom bunk sat up. James could feel the weight of its presence as the breathing intensified, the sound now separated from him by only the thin mattress and slats of wood. Terrified, James could feel the creature's awareness, its attention focused solely on him. He dared not move, his body paralyzed with fear. Then came the worst part. It began to touch the wooden slats beneath his mattress. Slowly at first, it ran what James imagined to be long skeletal fingers across the wood, almost caressing it. Then, with sudden force, it jabbed through the slats, pressing into the mattress and into James's side. A scream tore from James's throat, piercing the silence. In response, the thing below began shaking the bunk violently. The frame scraped against the wall, and paint flakes fell onto James's blanket as the bed rocked back and forth with unnatural force. The noise and movement stopped only when his mother burst into the room, her warm embrace calming him once again. When she asked what had happened, James couldn't bring himself to explain. All he could do was repeat one word over and over: nightmare. She stayed with him again that night, unaware of the malicious presence that had been tormenting her son. This terrifying routine repeated night after night. James would wake to the sound of sheets rustling or the creature's ragged breathing. Each time, he screamed before it could touch him again, and each time, his mother rushed in to comfort him. The thing never appeared while she was there, but James could feel its hateful presence lingering, just out of sight. James feigned illness on some nights to avoid his room, but he couldn't escape forever. The bunk bed, and whatever lived in it, waited for him. James's life grew darker as winter arrived. The nights became longer, giving his nightly visitor more time to torment him. By now, James had grown used to its presence. He didn't fear it any less, but he had learned to survive. He clung to one truth: as long as his mother stayed nearby, the thing could not harm him. But one winter evening, that small comfort was taken away. James's grandmother, battling dementia, had worsened, and his mother needed to stay with her overnight. When James learned of her absence, his first thoughts were not of his grandmother's suffering, but of what might happen to him alone in that room. Panic set in as James returned home from school. He stripped the bottom bunk of its mattress and slats, replacing them with a desk, chairs, and drawers, determined to deny the thing any place to hide. He told his father he was building an office, a small, innocent lie that brought him no relief. That night, James lay awake, clutching a small crucifix he had taken from his mother's jewelry box. He wasn't deeply religious, but in his desperation, he hoped it might protect him. Sleep came eventually, but his fragile peace was shattered by terror. He awoke in the middle of the night. The room was silent, eerily so. There were no rustling sheets, no wheezing breaths. But the room didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, oppressive, and wrong. The nightly visitor was no longer beneath him. It was in his bed. James's heart raced as he realized the weight pressing down on him wasn't his blanket. Something lay under the covers with him. He dared not move, barely able to breathe, his voice stolen by fear. Hours seemed to pass as he lay frozen, the dark winter night dragging on endlessly. Sunrise felt like a lifetime away. Desperation began to replace fear. He had to escape, but how? He thought of leaping from the bed and running for the door, but what if it was faster? What if it caught him? He then remembered the crucifix, his one hope. His hand slipped under the pillow where he had placed it, but it wasn't there. Frantically, he felt around, but the crucifix was gone. Had it fallen? Or worse, had the thing taken it? With hope fading, James realized he couldn't wait any longer. He had to move. He considered the possibility. Maybe the thing was asleep. It hadn't moved or made a sound since he woke. Could it be resting, believing it had finally won? Or was it waiting, savoring its moment of triumph? Summoning every ounce of courage, James began to move. Slowly, he reached for the blanket, his hand trembling as he peeled it back. His fingers brushed against something cold, something unnatural. As James pulled back the blanket, his fingers grazed something smooth and cold, something unmistakably alive. A gaunt hand. He froze, holding his breath, terrified that the creature would realize he was awake. But nothing happened. It didn't stir. It felt lifeless. Summoning what little courage he had left, James moved his hand further down. He touched a thin, malformed forearm, then a disproportionately large bicep. The arm lay stretched across his chest, its cold hand gripping his shoulder as though it had seized him in his sleep. For a brief moment, James considered pushing the arm away, But when his hand brushed against the thing's tattered, oily hair, revulsion overtook him. He dared not touch its face, though the morbid curiosity still haunts him to this day. Then it moved. The arm tightened its grip, curling around him like a snake. James's body stiffened as he realized something horrifying. The creature wasn't entirely in his bed. It was protruding from the wall itself, as if its lair lay within the very structure of the room. Before James could react, the arm's grip turned into a sudden, violent pull. The creature clawed at his clothes, dragging him closer to the wall. James struggled, but its strength was overwhelming. The thing shifted under the blanket, its head rising and writhing. He realized with sickening clarity where it was taking him, into the wall. James screamed, his voice finally breaking free as he fought desperately to escape. The creature's head emerged from beneath the blanket, wheezing and coughing. Though James has no clear memory of its face, he can still recall its breath, foul and ice-cold against his skin. The first rays of sunlight broke through the window, flooding the room with light. The creature recoiled, its grip loosening as if the sunlight itself had wounded it. James fought harder, clinging to the hope that the dawn would save him. But before the thing fully retreated, its scrawny fingers encircled his neck, squeezing the life out of him. Just as the world began to fade, he blacked out. When James awoke, it was morning. His father stood by his bed, cheerfully offering to make breakfast. Relief washed over him, but the memories of the night before clung to him like a shadow. Determined to protect himself, James moved his bed away from the wall, leaving the room's strange furniture untouched. He hoped that his precautions would keep the creature at bay. Weeks passed without incident, and James began to feel safe again. But on one frigid night, the stillness was broken. He awoke to the sound of furniture vibrating violently in the corner of the room where the bunk bed once stood. The noise stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving only an eerie silence. For a brief moment, James thought he heard wheezing, distant but unmistakable, echoing from deep within the wall. James never told anyone about his experience. Even now, he breaks out in a cold sweat at the sound of rustling sheets or the wheeze of a winter cold. And he has one unbreakable rule: never place his bed against a wall. Years later, his family moved him to a larger room on the opposite side of the house. His parents took his old room, claiming they didn't need much space. They lasted just 10 days. On the 11th, they moved. James's new room, sanctuary, a welcomed reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of his old one. Spacious and warm, it quickly became a source of comfort. For the first time in years, James felt at peace, convinced that he had left the horrors behind. But safety, as he would soon learn, is fleeting. On the second night, James heard it, faint breathing. The sound was rhythmic and distant, barely audible. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, or perhaps the sound of his own breath. But when he held his breath, it continued, a quiet, steady inhale and exhale. Memories of his previous encounters stirred uneasily in his mind. He turned on the light. The sound vanished. His eyes wandered to an old, worn armchair at the foot of his bed. It had always been there, a gift from a cousin, but something about it felt unsettling. Acting on impulse, James turned the chair to face away from the bed, hoping it would bring him some peace of mind. The third night shattered that fragile peace. James awoke in darkness, every sense on high alert. Outside, the faint hum of distant traffic and the swaying of tree branches offered a fragile sense of normalcy. But his room wasn't quiet. A soft creak came from the foot of his bed, the sound of something shifting its weight. His eyes darted to the darkness, searching for movement. Everything appeared untouched. The chair was still facing away, unchanged. Reassuring himself that it was nothing, James considered turning on the TV to settle his nerves. Then, another creak. This time, it was followed by a faint shuffling noise. James's eyes snapped back to the chair. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, shrouded in shadows. But as he stared, unease clawed its way into his mind. The longer he looked, the more the truth revealed itself. The chair wasn't empty. Someone was sitting in it. James froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. In the dim light, he could make out the faint outline of a head. It shifted slightly, the slow creak of movement breaking the stillness. His blood ran cold as the figure leaned to one side. A hand emerged from the shadows, its long, bony fingers curling over the edge of the chair. The figure began to rise, and two faint pinpoints of light appeared where its eyes should have been. They locked onto him. James screamed. His mother and brother burst into the room, the light flooding in as they flung the door open. The chair was empty. James sat frozen, unable to speak, his terror unexplainable. He managed only a few more nights in that room before his family decided to move. On his final night there, James woke to the sensation of warm breath against his ear. The rhythmic sound of breathing filled the room, louder than before. Panicked, he bolted upright and turned on the light. Nothing. He spent the rest of the night curled up on the living room couch, unable to return to his room. 2 years passed, and in their new home, James finally began to feel safe again. The memories of that suburban house began to fade, dulled by time. But the past wasn't done with him yet. One night, James woke from a restless sleep, relieved to find himself in the safety of his bed. The room felt darker than usual, the shadows unnaturally heavy. He chuckled nervously, realizing he must have pulled the blanket over his face while sleeping. The fabric was cool against his skin, but the air beneath it was stifling. As he prepared to pull the blanket down for fresh air, he heard it again, breathing. Slow, rhythmic, and unmistakable. James froze beneath the blanket. The sound was impossibly close, the steady breaths brushing against him. His chest tightened as fear gripped him. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered into the suffocating darkness, "Please stop." For a moment, the breathing changed. It became quicker, more erratic. James heard shuffling beside him, the unmistakable sound of movement. The presence seemed to retreat, moving toward the foot of the bed, then across the room. The sound of its steps faded into the hallway and disappeared. James lay in trembling silence, too scared to move, but his relief was short-lived. Without warning, a crushing weight pressed down on him. The blanket was forced against his face, suffocating him. Long, spindly fingers wrapped around his head, their sharp nails scraping his skin as they tightened their grip. Desperate, James slid into the narrow gap between the bed and the wall. He clawed his way out, screaming as he stumbled into the hallway. His cries woke the entire household. That night, James knew with chilling certainty, whatever haunted him wasn't there to frighten, it wanted to kill him. Years passed. James buried the memories of that house deep within him, refusing to speak of them. But one day, driven by a mix of courage and desperation, he decided to confront his fears. He began writing down every detail, hoping that exposing the horrors would rob them of their power. For a time, it seemed to work. The memories became easier to bear, their hold on him weakening. But the unease eventually returned. At first, James dismissed his anxiety as the result of dredging up old traumas. But the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just unease, it was a sense of something approaching. The days felt heavy, the nights restless. Though nothing overtly supernatural occurred, the sensation of being watched lingered, as if something hovered just on the edge of his awareness. Unable to ignore it any longer, James made a bold decision. He would return to the house. He would confront the memories in person and prove to himself that they were nothing more than a child's imagination. Armed with his adult logic and resolve, he set out on the hour-long drive to his old neighborhood. The journey filled him with a strange mix of elation and trepidation. As the streets grew more familiar, so did the memories, playing at the local park, football games on the ash pitch, and childhood friendships long since faded. He felt like a prodigal son returning home. When he finally turned onto the street where he had grown up, a wave of nostalgia hit him. The road stretched long and narrow, flanked by houses that seemed to close in, their age and architecture leering at him like silent sentinels. James took a deep breath, bracing himself as he approached the place where his nightmares had begun. James reached into the hollow of the sycamore tree, hoping to retrieve a piece of his childhood. Damp leaves and debris clung to his hand as he worked to pull something free. The texture of the object felt familiar, sharp, rigid edges like the toy soldier he had hidden there years ago. A wave of excitement swept over him, a spark of nostalgia and joy, but the joy was short-lived. As James brought the object into the light, his heart sank. It wasn't his toy soldier. It was the remains of a small animal, long decayed. The fragile bones crumbled in his grip, and traces of matted fur and debris clung to his fingers. A foul odor wafted up, making James recoil in disgust and nearly lose his balance. Disturbed, he buried the remains under the loose soil in the garden, offering a quiet, remorseful apology to whatever creature had ended up there. Shaken but resolute, James left the house. Despite the unsettling discovery, he felt a sense of empowerment from his visit. He had confronted the house, delved into its secrets, and emerged with a newfound control over his fears. For the first time in years, he believed he could finally leave it all behind. But as he drove away, a strange unease began to creep into his mind. An inexplicable and irrational compulsion took hold, urging him to get home as quickly as possible. With each passing mile, the unease grew stronger, his heart pounding harder, as though in sync with his rising anxiety. James kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following him. The anxiety soon became unbearable. He pushed his car to its limits, weaving through traffic, his knuckles clenched tightly around the steering wheel. The world outside blurred into streaks of light and shadow, but the storm of fear inside him raged on. He yelled at himself to calm down, to stop being irrational. Yet no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, he couldn't shake the overpowering feeling that something was chasing him. Finally, James turned onto the country roads leading to his town. The darkness of the countryside seemed to press against his car, heavy and suffocating. The narrow, winding roads felt like a trap, pulling him deeper into isolation. Relief washed over him only when he spotted the first lamppost marking the boundary of his town. Moments later, he pulled up outside his house. For a while, James sat in the quiet of his car, trying to collect himself. He let out a bitter laugh, mocking his own irrational thoughts. This is madness, he thought. Tomorrow, it ends. No more writing about childhood fears, no more revisiting those memories. I'll move on. I'll focus on my work, my girlfriend, and my belief in science and logic. Then something moved. The cold, rancid breath of the thing in the back seat brushed against the nape of his neck. Its icy fingers dug into his shoulder, sending a surge of terror coursing through his body. James scrambled for the door, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. Fear consumed him, the same primal fear he had felt during those childhood nights in that sickening room. Finally, the door clicked open and James tumbled out onto the pavement. For the briefest moment, he turned and saw it. The thing in the back seat was indistinct, its form vague, but its face, twisted and grinning from ear to ear, was unmistakable. It looked like an old man, but distorted, wrong. And then it was gone. The car was empty. James grabbed his keys, slammed the door shut, and locked it with his foot. Staggering up the path, he barely made it into the house. Shaking, he poured himself a drink and downed it in one gulp, desperate for the numbness of sleep to take him away from the nightmare. But the nightmare wasn't over. James awoke to a chilling sight, a broken toy soldier lying on his chest. It was the very same soldier he had hidden in the hollow of the sycamore tree as a child. But now, it was bitten in half. The message was unmistakable. The thing that had haunted him as a child had returned. His stomach dropped when his gaze landed on his bedroom window, slightly ajar. Upon closer inspection, he noticed the latches had been bent back, as if pried open with brute force. The frame bore 3 deep indentations, uneven, sharp marks that resembled claws more than anything made by a tool. Nothing in the house was missing, but James knew the truth. Whatever had been in the back seat of his car had entered his home, leaving a dark, mocking message. I'm here. The realization brought back the same paralyzing dread he had felt as a child. But now, his fear carried an even heavier weight. He wasn't living alone anymore. His girlfriend, Mary, was part of his life. What if this thing wasn't just after him? What if it came for her too? Mary was away for work, traveling across the country to organize events and exhibitions as she often did. Her absence usually gave James time to write and embrace solitude. But now, with the events of the past few days, he longed for her presence. He felt exposed, consumed by guilt and terror, knowing he had brought something malignant into their home. When Mary arrived that evening, James tried to put on a brave face, greeting her with a warm embrace and a kiss. But Mary, with her gentle and perceptive nature, immediately noticed something was wrong. What's bothering you? She asked, her concern evident. James hesitated, fumbling for the right words. He told her a half-truth, explaining that he had been writing about a frightening childhood memory and that revisiting those dark moments had unsettled him. He couldn't bring himself to mention the toy soldier, the claw marks, or the thing he feared might still be lurking. Mary, ever supportive, sat James down on the couch and encouraged him to talk. But James held back, unable to admit the full truth. Instead, he reassured her that his fears were just childish imaginings from years ago, dredged up by his writing. He even spun a story to explain the damaged window latch, brushing it off as a random break-in attempt. Deep down, James knew he was lying to her, not out of malice, but out of fear. He wanted to protect her from the horror he believed was now stalking them. But as he looked at Mary's concerned face, he felt the crushing weight of his deceit. He had brought something sinister into their lives, and he hadn't been honest about it. James had lied to Mary, spinning a tale about a burglar to hide the truth of what had been haunting him. She believed him, offering kindness and sympathy, but James felt the weight of his deception. His dishonesty had driven a wedge between them, one that the malevolent force from his past could exploit. That night, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of Mary's breathing beside him. It was a small comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone. But James knew sleep wouldn't come easily. He had experienced this before. The creature's presence would start subtly, slowly building its grip on him until it revealed itself fully. By 4 a.m., sleep overcame him. He sank into its embrace, the anxieties of the day drifting away. But even in the depths of sleep, something stirred. A faint noise, quiet and invasive, began to pull him back to consciousness. James opened his eyes and adjusted to the darkness. Mary was still sleeping peacefully, her breath steady. He tried to ignore the sound, but it persisted. It was faint and muffled, like a repetitive murmur coming from somewhere nearby. The sound grated against his nerves, growing more distinct with each passing second. Unable to sleep, James sat up, straining to locate the source. As he listened, he recognized the voice, aged, raspy, and harsh, muttering at a frantic pace. The sound reminded him of confused residents in his grandmother's nursing home, their fragmented words looping endlessly. James glanced at Mary again, reassured by her calm, steady breaths. He rose from the bed, each step on the cold floor amplifying the sound. The murmuring grew louder as he moved closer to the source, and his fear deepened when he recognized something chilling in the voice. It was saying his name. A cold shiver ran. The creature knew who he was. The realization made him feel vulnerable, as if its knowledge gave it an unstoppable reach. He stared into the dim room, searching for the source of the voice. Then he saw it. The curtains. They swayed slightly, as though disturbed by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The moonlight barely outlined the figure standing between the curtains and the window. James's breath caught in his throat. It was there, hiding in plain sight. Despite his fear, a strange compulsion overtook him. He had to confront it, to see it for himself. Slowly, he stepped forward, his trembling hand reaching for the curtain. The murmuring grew louder, its pace frantic, its tone agitated. James brushed the fabric, causing it to ripple slightly, parting just enough to reveal the thing behind it. And in that fleeting moment, James saw it. James froze at the sight of the creature. Shrouded behind the curtains, its skeletal frame quivered unnaturally as it murmured indecipherable words. The emaciated figure seemed human in the loosest sense. Its pale, bruised skin stretched tight over protruding bones, its vertebrae and ribs visible beneath its thin husk of flesh. A sharp, offensive stench filled the air, as though death itself clung to the creature. At first, James felt pity, a fleeting moment of compassion for the wretched, starved figure. But the pity dissolved as he realized the truth. This was no victim. It was a predator. The trembling wasn't from cold or fear. It was anticipation, a sick excitement coursing through the fiend's unnatural body. Gathering his courage, James reached for the curtain to pull it back, determined to expose the monstrosity. But then, it spoke. "Look behind you." A cold breath slid down James's neck, freezing him in place. For a moment, terror overtook him, but then love pushed through his fear. Mary. She was sleeping in the same room as this abomination. James turned slowly, his muscles trembling, the stench of the creature's breath filling the air. And then Mary screamed. The sound tore through James, shattering his composure. He spun around and saw it, not behind him, but on the bed. The creature was on Mary, its bony frame writhing as it pinned her down. Its sharp spine jutted grotesquely through tattered cloth, its inhuman body contorting with glee. James lunged at it, grabbing, pulling, and striking with every ounce of strength he had. but its loose, decayed skin slipped through his fingers, and its unnatural strength resisted him. The creature pressed Mary's face into the pillow, its gangly limbs arching and twisting as it clawed at her. Mary's muffled screams filled the room, her body writhing in desperation. James yelled, pleaded, begged the creature to stop, offering himself in her place. But his cries only seemed to spur it on, driving it to new depths of depravity. Then it paused. One hand still held Mary's head against the pillow, while its other began to stroke her hair, almost gently. James's stomach churned at the sight, but he fought harder, climbing onto the creature's back and wrapping his arm around its throat. He squeezed with all his strength, his chin digging into its rough, cold shoulder as its spine pressed painfully into his stomach. The creature moved with an unnatural fluidity, twisting its head toward James. Its neck cracked and cracked, turning at an impossible angle until it faced him directly. Its eyes were pits of blackness, devoid of light, reflecting nothing but malice. The corners of its mouth curled into a grotesque approximation of a grin, and from its throat came a wheezing, otherworldly sound, almost like laughter. James screamed in rage, tightening his grip, but the creature ignored him. It kept stroking Mary's hair with one hand while staring deep into James's soul. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it yanked a fistful of hair from Mary's scalp, leaving behind a gaping wound. Mary whimpered in pain, her voice too broken for a scream. And then it was gone. James turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. Mary lay trembling, her back covered in deep scratches, and the bed soaked in blood. James held her, whispering reassurances, but his words felt hollow. Mary wept uncontrollably, clutching him as though he was the only thing anchoring her to reality. James's world shattered as Mary looked at him with a mix of betrayal, disgust, and fear. She thought he was the one who had attacked her. Despite his frantic attempts to explain, to tell her about the creature, she refused to believe him. Who could blame her? To anyone else, the story would seem absurd. As Mary packed her things, she told James she wouldn't call the police, on the condition that he never contacted her again. Her parting words cut deeper than anything the creature had done. She looked at him one last time, tears streaming down her face, and then she was gone. James sat in the silence of his empty home, knowing he had lost the love of his life forever. To Mary, he was the monster, not the thing that had tormented him for decades. The weight of the loss pressed down on him, but beneath the despair, a spark of determination ignited. He knew what had to be done. James wasn't going to let the creature destroy anyone else's life. He had spent too many years living in fear, reliving the horrors of his childhood. Now, it was time to confront the wretch that had haunted him for so long. He knew he was likely walking into his own death, but it didn't matter. If it meant ensuring the creature couldn't harm another soul, it was a price he was willing to pay. With resolve, James began preparing. He packed a bag, wrote letters to Mary and his family explaining the truth, and made a few final phone calls. He didn't tell them what he was planning, only that he loved them. His mother, sensing something was wrong, pressed him for answers, but James only reassured her before saying goodbye. As night fell, James sat in his car, the passenger door open, waiting. The street outside was eerily quiet, the cold air biting at his skin. He sat there for hours, his mind racing with questions. Could something like this even be killed? Was it alive, or was it some malevolent force beyond his comprehension? At first, nothing happened. Then, just as he began to doubt his plan, he felt it. The subtle shift in the car's suspension. It was here. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of decay. James's breath caught in his throat as he heard the faintest whisper from the back seat. Slowly, he leaned over and shut the passenger door, sealing himself inside with the creature. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and began driving. As he pulled out of the street, he heard it, a quiet, mocking snicker from the back seat. It was almost as if the creature knew what James had planned, and it found the idea amusing. James drove into the desolate countryside, the car slicing through the night as it carried him and his unearthly passenger toward their final destination. The dark hills rose and fell around him, the isolation of the landscape pressing down like a physical weight. James gripped the wheel, his mind locked in grim determination. Tonight, he will end it. The car's wheels skidded and slid on uneven terrain as James turned off the narrow country road. Ahead, the land abruptly ended at a cliff, an abandoned quarry overlooking a deep black lake. Decades ago, the area had been the site of a tragic subsidence, swallowing part of a road and taking lives with it. Local legends spoke of ghosts haunting the lake, but tonight, James brought with him something far worse. James parked several meters from the cliff's edge and killed the engine. He left the car in darkness, sitting in silence as he steeled himself for what was to come. He couldn't drive the car straight over the edge. It would sense the trap. No, he had to wait, let it attack, let it believe it had won. Only then could he plunge the car into the icy depths, taking the creature with it. He would drown the abomination, even if it meant sacrificing himself. For what felt like hours, James sat in the stillness, the occasional splash of water against the cliff below his only companion. He waited, heart pounding, until he finally heard it, a faint, rasping breath from behind him. The air grew thick, fouled by the rank stench of decay. The temperature inside the car plummeted, frost forming on the windshield as his breath became visible in the moonlight. James didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to look to know it was there. But then the creature moved closer. Its foul, labored breathing was louder now, coming from just over his shoulder. Slowly, James turned his head, his body trembling with fear and revulsion. It was sitting in the passenger seat. The figure hunched forward, its frail body contorted in an unsettling way. Its long, thin arms stretched out, as if trying to overcome an unseen force. It moved toward James with erratic, disjointed motions. One weak leg creaked as it dragged over his lap, drawing the figure closer until it was nearly on top of him. In the dim light, James could make out its face. The skin sagged over sharp features, revealing broken teeth and tendons where the flesh had withered. Its hollow eyes stared at him, and a strange grin spread across its face. The figure's breath filled the air, making James's eyes sting. He instinctively recoiled, feeling sick, as it let out a raspy sound, signaling some form of satisfaction. James realized something important. It wasn't as powerful as it once was. Its movements were sluggish and its form frail, though still unsettling. Perhaps its confinement had weakened it, but it was still dangerous. As James processed the situation, the figure extended one long finger and pressed it into his shoulder. James gasped as the sharp pain shot through his body, each movement making it worse. The creature seemed to delight in his agony, laughing as it traced his face with a twisted gesture of mock affection. It was now or never. Fighting through the pain, James turned the key with his free hand and slammed the car into gear. The vehicle lurched, sliding toward the cliff. The creature screeched, trying to claw its way to him. But James held firm, the fury inside giving him strength. Memories of Mary, her injured face, her painful farewell, flashed in his mind. He shouted in frustration and hit the accelerator. The cliff's edge loomed, fast approaching. At the last second, James unlocked the door and braced himself. He shoved the creature away, sending it flailing in the back seat. With a burst of adrenaline, James threw the door open and leaped out of the car. He hit the ground with a crash, rolling across the rocky landscape as the car careened over the edge. It plunged into the dark waters below, the sound of the impact deafening. For a moment, all was still. Then, from below came an eerie sound, guttural and desperate. James crawled to the cliff's edge, peering down into the abyss. The creature struggled in the water, its body writhing in the icy cold. And then, silence. James lay on the ground, staring at the sky. He was alive. He had made it. Or so he thought. The car sank into the frigid water, cold seeping in through the broken door. James gasped, the freezing water pressing in, but the creature was not so fortunate. It thrashed, trying to escape, but its decaying form was no match for the depths. Despite the chilling cold, James refused to let it slip away. With a clenched fist, he struck the creature, its rotting skin tearing under the force. The figure struggled toward the door, desperately trying to escape. But as James prepared for what he believed would be his final moment, he noticed something. Its leg was trapped beneath the crushed dashboard. It couldn't move. A wave of relief washed over him, and he turned toward the door, determined to avoid his doom. Before he could escape, the creature grabbed him, pulling him back with unexpected force. Its skeletal fingers dug into him as they fought in the sinking vehicle, the freezing water darkening as they descended further. James's lungs screamed for air, his body begging for oxygen, but he fought on, kicking his legs to break free. At last, he pushed himself away from the dashboard, freeing himself and swimming toward the faint light above. As he broke the surface, James inhaled sharply, the freezing water biting at his skin. Behind him, the creature's muffled cries echoed through the depths as the car sank into the dark waters. The sound faded into silence, leaving James alone in the stillness. James stumbled through the wilderness for hours, the cold gnawing at him. His shoulder burned from the creature's attack, but he pressed on, driven by sheer will. When he finally reached his street, the sight of his home gave him a fleeting sense of victory. He had survived. He had triumphed over the creature. But as he entered his house, that fragile sense of triumph shattered. Large, wet footprints led from the front door to his bedroom. James froze, disbelief quickly turning into dread. It couldn't be. He had seen it perish. He had left it behind. Yet, as he crept toward his bedroom, he saw it. The creature lay in his bed, its frail form covered by a white sheet. Exhausted but resolute, James devised a new plan. Quietly, he grabbed his wallet and left the house, returning an hour later with supplies. This would end tonight. He entered the spare room, setting up for the final showdown. Lying in the strange bed, James feigned sleep, waiting for the creature to make its move. Eventually, exhaustion took over. He awoke to cold, skeletal hands gripping his neck. The creature hovered above him, coughing and wheezing, dark liquid dripping from its wounds. James gasped for air, his resistance weakening as its fingers tightened. He realized he couldn't overpower it. Instead, he went limp, playing dead. The creature paused, its breath slowing. It released James, staring at him in confusion. Then, leaning in, it spat a foul liquid onto his face. James fought the urge to react, the rancid liquid burning his skin. He lay still, waiting for the right moment. The creature prodded his injured shoulder, digging its sharp fingers into the wound. Pain shot through James, but he stayed still. Then, the creature pushed its long, rotting fingers into his mouth. The taste was unbearable, vile and sour. Its fingers scraped against the inside of his throat as it forced them deeper. James gagged, his body instinctively reacting. The creature let out a guttural laugh, its twisted grin widening as it pushed further. James's vision blurred, the pain and revulsion threatening to overwhelm him. But he waited, biding his time for the moment to strike. In the darkness of his most desperate moment, James found his strength. Rolling to the side, he used the creature's weight against it, breaking free from its grasp. He fell to the floor, kicking and screaming as the creature lunged for him, its long, skeletal fingers grasping at his legs. With one final burst of effort, James pulled himself free. The creature stood tall, its brittle bones cracking as it rose from the bed. It loomed over James, towering and gaunt, preparing to pounce. But James wasn't the frightened child it had tormented years ago. He was done being a victim. Years of terror, pain, and loss crystallized into a single moment of defiance. The creature had made a fatal mistake. It underestimated its prey. As the creature hissed and twisted, readying itself to attack, James sprang into action. He pulled a blanket from the floor, revealing a hidden bucket of gasoline. With all his strength, he hurled the bucket at the monstrosity. The liquid splashed over its emaciated body and soaked the bed. The creature paused, its hideous grin stretching wider. It mocked him, its wheezing breath rasping out what sounded like a taunt. But James wasn't afraid anymore. From his pocket, he pulled out a lighter. With a flick, the flame danced in his hand, and he threw it onto the creature. The fire roared to life, engulfing the creature and the bed in an instant. The thing shrieked, its inhuman cries echoing through the house. Flesh crumbled away, revealing blackened bones beneath. The flames consumed it, searing away every piece of its twisted form. For a fleeting moment, James almost felt pity. But as he watched the thing writhe in agony, all he could think was, let it burn. The fire quickly grew out of control. Smoke filled the room, and James struggled to escape. He remembered little of how he made it out, but he woke hours later in a hospital bed, his hands bandaged and his body aching from burns and smoke inhalation. His mind, however, was clear. The creature was gone. The police weren't as convinced. They suspected arson and questioned James about the fire. His injuries and the destruction of his home raised more questions than answers. No human remains were found, but the charred outline of a figure was etched into the bed and wall, as though the creature had tried to escape but failed. The investigators didn't believe James's story, but he didn't care. The weight that had haunted him since childhood was gone. Now, James sits in a modest hotel room, writing his story. His hands ache, and his body is scarred, but his spirit is resolute. For the first time in decades, he feels free. The creature is gone. He knows it in his very soul. Tonight, he plans to sleep without fear, to dream as he once did as a child before the thing invaded his life. But old habits die hard. As James rests in the quiet of the hotel room, his mind occasionally wanders. Shadows in the corner feel a little too dark. The faint creak of the bed beneath him makes his heart skip a beat. He reminds himself that it's over, that the creature is gone. But a lifetime of fear isn't easily forgotten. As he drifts off to sleep, James reflects on his journey. He survived, he conquered, and now he hopes his story will help others do the same, should they ever face the darkness he endured. Good night. Sleep tight.